Dear colleagues and friends, I am pleased to welcome you today to Vladimir Feshchenko's lecture. Vladimir will speak today on the topic language writing, the American-Russian transfers. First, however, I would like to introduce our speaker today. Vladimir is currently on a fellowship at our Center Russian Language Poetry in Transition. His research project is dedicated to the topic the poetries of language studies in Russian and American experimental writing. Vladimir comes from Moscow. He is employed as Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Linguistics of the Russian Academy of Science. He is Deputy Head of the Research and Education Center, Modern Communication Theory and Practice. He received his PhD at the Institute of Linguistics in 2004. His dissertation dealt with language experiment in Russian and English poetics of the 1910s and 1920s. He has recently habilitated in the same institute. In 2011, he was awarded by the Russian Academy of Science for young researchers in the domain of languages and literatures for the monograph Laboratory of the Logos, Linguistic Experimentation in Avant-garde Writings. Vladimir's main research areas are linguistic poetics, language and literature, theoretical linguistics and semiotics, and especially Russian, English, and French language and the 20th century literature in these languages. And he is interested in the history of linguistic ideas and in the history of literature, especially his interests are in Russian and European avant-garde art and in contemporary Russian and American poetry. Vladimir has published already 3 monographs. The first one I already mentioned. And in 2009, he was the co-author of a book about lingual aesthetics and semiotics of art named Satvarenie znaka. And 3 years ago, he published the monograph on the linguistics of literary avant-garde, Literaturny avant-garde na lingwistyckich поворотах. Vladimir has written a large number of essays. I could not mention them all here, but I would like to point out the three of his most recent publications. This is in the journal Russian Literature, Subjectivation through Objectification in the Poetic Text, and with a co-author, Voice and Bodily Deixis as Manifestation of Performativity in Written Texts in Semiotica. And last but not least, Graphic Translation of Experimental Verse as a strategy of poetic text transcreation in the journal Studia Metrica et Poetica. We now look forward to your presentation, Vladimir, and I turn the floor over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Henrike. First and foremost, I would really like to thank the whole team of the DFG-Kolleg Forschungsgruppe for making my research in Trier University possible and feasible in these troubling times. Troubling, but good for research. The talk I'm going to do today is the result of 2 interconnected projects I have been carrying out over the last several months. The first of them is a book-length study dedicated to what I call the poetries of language in Russian and American experimental writing of the last century. And this research was largely supported by the Lyrik in Transition Fellowship, for which I'm immensely grateful to Henrike Stahl and Trier University. The second project is an anthology of contemporary American innovative poetry in the Russian translations, spanning from the Black Mountain College and the San Francisco Renaissance of the 1950s, 60s, up to the New York School and the language movement. I'm working on this anthology with my co-editor, Jan Probstein, who is here with us as well, and we hope this anthology will be published later this year by NLO Publishing House in Moscow. And in this talk, I will focus on what constitutes the largest part of this anthology, the language movement, and its Russian backgrounds, both as a source of inspiration and an outcome of creative reception. I will argue that language writing was largely informed by a turn to language, which in its turn was a part of a series of linguistic turns over the 20th century, initiated first by Saussure, Wittgenstein, and Russian formalists. It is through this prism of this linguistic turn that language poetry was developing in the US and was later interpreted by Russian language-oriented poetics. So here's an outline of the lecture. I will begin by a glimpse into a historical background for language-oriented poetries in the US and in Russia that might be considered the precursors to language writing as a movement. Next, I am going to touch upon the milestones and the key characteristics of language writing, American language writing in the 1970s and up to date. And my particular focus will be on the points of interdisciplinary transfer between language poetry and linguistics of its time. I will look into how linguistic ideas found their way through to new poetics. And finally, I will highlight the points of intercultural transfers between American language-centered writing and its Russian counterparts in the 1980s and up to date. And the keynote here will be on the reciprocal transfers between the two intellectual cultures that have both informed the poetics of language poets and later on contributed to certain trends in contemporary Russian poetry. And that's why I replaced the hyphen between the words American and Russian in the title of the presentation with a both-way arrow, meaning the two-directional transfers that have been going on between Russian and American language-oriented writings. So, poetries of language is a strange term. It's not a literary established term. It is my own metaphorical way to refer to various forms of linguistic experimentation in poetry in general, in all times. And I would like to start my discussion of the poetries of language with the great American pre-modernist poet, Walt Whitman, and his now famous letter he wrote to a friend, in which he noted two factors concerning Russia and America. Firstly, the geographical distance between Russia and the United States. Our countries so distant, so unlike at first glance, he writes. And secondly, the closeness in what he names some vastest features between Russians and Americans, in certain features and vastest ones so resembling each other. Yet, in the cultural and literary sense, the two traditions have been quite distant from each other and developed in many respects independently of each other. And this is especially true for the 20th century when it comes to experimental and avant-garde literature. Experimental writing in the United States has always been deeply rooted in the poetry of Walt Whitman. Whitman was, among other things, a language reformer who anticipated the revolution in poetic language in the following century. In a self-commentary to his opus magnum, Leaves of Grass, Whitman embraces the concept of language experiment, thereby calling for innovation in poetry. He writes, I sometimes think The Leaves is only a language experiment. Whitman was an ardent reader of linguistic works of his time. Most notable is his interest in Wilhelm von Humboldt's theory of language. Language seen both as a creative activity and an expression of the national spirit. And this interest is manifest, for example, in this ode to language from his preface to Leaves of Grass, which sounds like a poem and a theoretical essay at the same time. An essay and an ode to the American language. Whitman's free and democratic verse arises as a poetry of creative energy of the word, a poetry of language well ahead of the time when poetry started to seriously engage with language experiments per se. For over a century now, the two national traditions of the language-oriented avant-garde, the American and the Russian, have been similarly persistent in revolutionizing the poetic language. As it happened, Whitman and Edgar Allan Poe proved to be the most powerful sources of inspiration from the American continent for Russian innovative literature of the early 20th century. And this reception threw a bridge from 19th century American pre-modernism to the 20th century high modernism and radical avant-garde in both countries, so distant from each other. It seems that in this fragment from Our Fundamentals, a manifesto by the Russian futurist Vladimir Feshchenko, implicitly appeals to Whitman, whose work had a huge impact on himself and on the Russian futurism in general. Khlyabnikov dreams of a universal language that would connect the two continents by what he metaphorically calls an express train bearing the mirroring words New York, Moscow. The language projects of Whitman and Khlyabnikov are charged with a common pathos, the transformation of their national language by poetic means. In an early essay, The Magic of Words, 1909, another pioneer of language-biased poetry and precursor to the formalist revolution in Russian theory and poetry, Andrei Bely, prophesied about the poetry of language. He wrote, "Humanity is alive as long as the poetry of language exists. The poetry of language is alive. We are alive." By invoking a poetry of language, Bely puts emphasis on language as such, which is capable of generating poetic speech and of word creation. But Bely looked even beyond that in Aaron's Rod, an essay written just at the time of the 1917 revolution, heralding a poetry of the word as the goal of new literature. For Bely, it was no longer a question of poeticization of language, but of linguistic transformation of poetry itself. Meanwhile, around 1912, 1913, simultaneously and independently of each other, revolutionary calls for liberation of poetic language were heard on the two continents. The first manifestations of avant-garde writings appeared almost simultaneously in Russia and America. And this convergence in the early avant-garde may be illustrated with the two poems, a famous one by Mayakovsky, Talk with the Taxman, and a lesser known by Mina Loy. This poem by Mina Loy, written in 1924, suggests an appalling similarity with Vladimir Mayakovsky's wording in his poem Talk with a Tax Collector about poetry, which was written just a bit later in 1926. This appalling similarity is in its themes of word as radium, of crushing the tonnage of language and extracting radium of the word. Well, Mayakovsky may or may not have heard about Mina Loy or Gertrude Stein, to whom Mina Loy's poem is dedicated, when he came to the US in 1925. Yet the idea, or what would we now call a conceptual metaphor of word as radium, or poetic word as radioactivity, seems to have been in the air on both continents and in both literary traditions. Later, Mayakovsky would prove to be a major source of inspiration for several generations of innovative American poetry. And it is especially the case with his influence on Frank O'Hara and Allen Ginsberg, both of whom would transfer this interest to Russian futurism, would transfer it to language poets. Another important precursor to language poetry was Jack Spicer, a member of the San Francisco Renaissance, which became both geographical and culturally a melting pot for many of the language poets. For some, in his youth, Spicer studied academic linguistics under the guidance of the famous structuralist Zelig Harris. His career as a linguist was quite short, but the linguistic apparatus subsequently entered his poetic works. In 1965, he published a poetry collection, Language, parts of which were named after linguistic disciplines, such as morphemics, phonetics, semantics, etc. And the cover of the collection ironically appropriated the cover of a major American academic journal, Language. In a famous poem from this collection, Thing Language, a challenge to linguisticality of poetry is brought up, marking a problematics that would later permeate language writings. In the 1970s, as the circles of language poets were beginning to shape up and institutionalize themselves by way of little magazines, talks, and readings, several names arose on the American poetic scene whose work dealt with language issues, though not being part of language poetry as such. And I'd like to mention just two of these names here, Rosemary, Waldrop, and Michael Palmer. Their poetics of Waldrop and Palmer is close to linguocentric writing and is largely determined by meta-language reflection as the generative principle of text generation. In her doctoral thesis, which later became the book with the symptomatic question-marked title Against Language, Waldrop rebelled against language as a fetish, or rather against the dictate of language. Instead, she offered a poetics of rupture, non-linear writing that revived the experiments of Gertrude Stein. Her important theoretical and poetic essay, Thinking of Follows, appeals from the very beginning to the poetics of composition as a process, and poetics of construction as a linguo-historical community. Communication across multiple languages and idioms is aimed, according to Waldrop, at destabilizing language as an ideological construct. I quote, "I do not use the language, I interact with it. I do not communicate via language, but with it. Language is not a tool for me, but a medium infinitely larger than my intention." Just as Waldrop, Michael Palmer has done a lot to make language writing possible without being formally part of the language school. As a poet, Palmer sets the task of a radical rediscovery of the nature of a poem in its relation to the language and the meta-language in which it is created. A poetic text is thought of as a contingency between language and the world it refers to. Therefore, in Palmer's texts, a reference can at any time turn into self-reference. A metaphor can find language as a base for assimilation, and a poetic line can be read as a proposition from linguistic philosophy and a performative act at the same time, as in this fragment from the poem Sun, a poem later translated into Russian by Alexei Parshikov. With this radical orientation towards language as such, in Palmer's poems at different levels of form and content, silence performs a special function. Arkady Dragomoshenko called him an alpine climber of silence, alpinist тишины. Palmer always correlated with the language movement and recognized the commonality of their attitudes. I'll just quote from an interview with Michael Palmer. "I think we had a common goal: to erase everything and to start over, to abandon the governing prescriptions and assumptions of institutionalized poetry practice and question the prevalent concepts of expressiveness, the self and the individual, the role of the reader." In 1983, Palmer compiled a small but influential anthology called Code of Signals, which included texts in both theory and poetry from authors experimenting across different writing modes. And characteristically, the book is opening with an epigraph from Osip Mandelstam, his essay Conversation about Dante, where Mandelstam wrote about poetry as a code of signals, signalizacja. So the reference to Dante was itself a signal of the reception of Russian poetics in the American context. Now to the language movement itself. The term language-centered poetry language-centered poetry was first used in 1973 by the Californian-based poet Ron Silliman. On the East Coast, from the end of the 1970s, Bruce Andrews and Charles Bernstein edited a newsletter with the title name of the movement, Language, separated by equal signs, when written in large, bold letters. A movement without special manifestos or official membership. This is how the community was defined by Bob Perelman, who prefers the term language writing rather than language poetry, meaning the multi-discourse manifestations of the movement. Charles Bernstein breaks the self-named language with equal signs, pointing to egalitarianism of the community members. Language poetry, a loose affiliation of unlike individuals. This is an excerpt from a text by him. Douglas Messerly, the compiler of one of the anthologies of language writing, introduces the expression language poetries into the title, indicating the plurality of poetics of the various authors of the movement. Language writing is indeed a more accurate term for these literary practices. They are not limited to poetry, although, of course, poetic discourse is paramount. The boundaries between poetry and prose, free and non-free verse, essay and treatise, theory and practice are eliminated here. Many of the texts are written and read at the same time as utterances and meta-utterances, both as poems and critical essays. The experience of French post-structuralist theory is embodied in a poetic form. A critical theory of discourse is created by a poetic discourse. The political meaning of such writing within the context of the protest culture in the United States after Vietnam is in criticizing the dominant discourses, in inverting the common speeches into a unique poetic language. Alexei Parshikov, who experienced the influence of language writing, conveyed its essence very justly. I will be giving some citations in the original Russian version, but don't worry, I will give an idea of what they are about. So Alexei Parshikov justly says that, quote, language was inherent to natural phenomena, scientific models, our body, and the forms of ideas that lived objectively in a special reserve, as in Karl Popper's World 3. American poets were interested in language as an extension of the body, intellect, and new technologies. Michael Palmer spoke of poetry marked by the quality of resistance and the necessary complexity with the obligatory breakthrough and rejection, as well as exploratory forms, end quote, from Parshikov. Research or professorial activities are also an important part of the language writer's public image. But research also means inquiry. One of the most important books by the language school is The Language of Inquiry by Eugene, who calls poetic language a language of inquiry. Eugene is recognized as one of the leading pioneers of the language movement on the West Coast of the United States. In her essay, Barbarism, which is included in to the Language of Inquiry, and which is a review of the historical context of the language movement, she points to some of the common features shared by a variety of authors working in this direction or tendency. Features such as the intersection of the aesthetic and the ethical, the isomorphism of aesthetic and social endeavors, new ways of thinking, and new relationships between the components of thought and writing. Hegelian sketches some basic features of language writing, of which I'd like to specifically underline those that concern the sort of linguistic activism and literary poetics. So one of the features she particularly stresses is that language is a preeminently social medium, and the structures of language are social structures in which meanings and intentions are already in place. Prose is not necessarily not poetry. Theory and practice are not antithetical. Writing as a metamorphosis of language is more important than what is written, as Eugene's early essay, Written as Writing, puts forward. Quote, writing as such arises from within a pre-existing text conceived by someone or someone else. It's not even a letter, but a composition process. In her hallmark essay, The Rejection of Closure, Eugene develops a theory of an open text, that is, a text open to the world and particularly to the reader. Quote, it invites participation, rejects the authority of the writer over the reader, and thus, by analogy, the authority implicit in other social, economical, cultural hierarchies. It speaks for writing that is generative rather than directive. One of the well-known specimens of Eugene's writing is the composition of the cell, a hybridized text that implements the principle of open structure. I'm sorry, I've only had a Russian version available, a version translated by Arkady Dragomoshenko, but you can clearly see this grid or table where each numbered line is a separate statement. But the order and linearity of reading is not predetermined by numbering and sequencing. The space of the poem is restructured by the act of reading. And Ludwig Wittgenstein's style of philosophical writings had a major impact on most language poets and some of their Russian counterparts as well, such as Arkady Dragomoshenko, especially in his later writings. The marginalization of poetry in a wide range of language writing is a feature highlighted by Bob Perelman, another ideologist of language writing from the San Francisco part. His programmatic text, The Marginalization of Poetry, is Perelman's sort of mini tractatus written in poetic form, or rather, its poetic form is reflexively criticized in the text itself, sometimes self-ironically, as the essay unfolds. According to Perelman, I quote, a special feature of language writing is its simultaneous engagement of the discourses of contemporary aesthetic, social, and political theory, and the tradition of non- or anti-academic experimental modernist and postmodern practice, end quote. A very typical and well-known piece of language writing is Charles Bernstein's text, Artifice of Absorption. Alexei Parshikov, who participated in its translation into Russian and wrote a preface to it, calls it a treatise-like poem or a learned poem. According to Parshikov, this text is manifest for the poetics of Charles Bernstein and is, I quote, a kind of constructivist poem where the real documentary material is the poet's reflection on the meaning of the device of verbal art. Throughout his entire work, Charles Bernstein hybridizes and amalgamates discourses. Yet he is well known as a satirical poet who plays ironically on popular cliches, phrases, and intertexts. This sort of linguistic satire is based on the clash of discourses in the arena of the poetic text. Most often, these are public discourses of mass action, political, media, or military. Thus, the definitions of war in his poem, The War Stories, sound like fragments of discourses of different caliber, from the ordinary and logical, philosophical, to the legal and geopolitical, with the inclusion of poetic metaphors in the midst of all of this heteroglossia. Ultimately, for a language writer, war is a way of writing. War is the extension of prose by other means, as one of the lines goes. A language writer from the East Coast, Robert Grineer, works with minimalist structures of poetic expression. He created a special format of publishing poetry. His series called Sentences from 1978 consists of 500 large format catalog cards piled together, each of which contains a short poem. And I find it in it a very close analog to Lev Rubinstein's cards, created in the same years in unofficial Russian literature. This treatment of a poem line as a sentence in itself was theorized by Ron Silliman. In a book of essays, The New Sentence, Silliman connects literary realism with bourgeois capitalism and demonstrates how this capitalism can be eradicated by new sentence theory and practice. The new sentence as a unit of language writing was supposed to minimize the syllogistic effect expected from prose through transformations in the structure, length, position of the sentence or utterance in the space of the text, and reinforcing its polysemy. And this is how Silliman's own poems are arranged, in particular the Chinese Notebook, which is built on the model of, again, Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations with their numbered sequences of aphorisms. The next part of my talk concerns what interests me most in language poetry at this point. That is the ways language poetry interacted with linguistic ideas of its time. And as you surely know, it was a time when Noam Chomsky's transformational grammar theories, as well as his political activism, were setting the agenda of intellectual debates in the States. Quoting Chomsky in one of his essays, Bob Perelman expresses his satirical approach to the politics of language. Quote, question, how do you tell a language from a dialect? Answer, a language is a dialect that has an army and a navy. Criticism of language as a political medium is characteristic of almost all representatives of the language movement. The first issue of this magazine, the magazine called This, featured Grineer's Manifesto on Speech, which straight away exposed a linguistic challenge. Grineer puts forward a slogan, I hate speech, which is paradoxically a speech act directed against speech, but at the same time, it is made out of it. What is questioned is the status of the utterance as such. It's belonging to either speech or language. The priority in this dichotomy was given to language as a space of discourse struggle. It is the struggle of speeches, meaning political speeches primarily. Thus, language became not only the material of literary experimentation and the subject of critical reflection, but also a tool for transforming thinking, critical thinking. As Lynn Hegenian elsewhere explained, I quote, poetry provided the means for reopening the question of language. It was through poetry that a series of reinventions of language could be initiated. We had at our disposal the medium that was perfectly suited for investigating the overt and covert, buried and transcendent, material and metaphysical logics which are language, and which so powerfully influence human thought and experience, end quote. Barrett Watton is one of the founding fathers of the language movement, and it's one of its major scholars, language scholars with a capital L, as it were, describes what was happening in the 1960s and afterwards as a new turn to language. He primarily speaks of the political aspect of this turn, linking it primarily with the free speech movements. As you know, for the first time, linguistic turn was a term publicized by Richard Rorty in 1967, retrospectively in relation to Ludwig Wittgenstein's philosophy of language. And at the very same time, in the 1960s and 70s, a new phase of this turn associated with the performative vector manifested itself in Western intellectual culture. And such were the multiple forms of linguistic and political activism in Europe and America, starting with the situationists in France and the beatniks in the US. Speaking of Russian-American ties and transfers, one cannot underestimate the importance of Roman Jakobson's linguistic conception for Charles Bernstein, as well as for other language poets in the 70s. Not only due to Jakobson's genetic connection with the formalist school, which was extremely important for them, but also in its updated version, expressed in the famous article of 1960, Linguistics and Poetics. Jakobson was prompted to write this article within the polemics with Noam Chomsky. And unlike Chomsky, the generativist, who admitted only a grammatical state of language and who deemed agrammatisms were not part of language, Jakobson advocated for a special poetic grammar as part of the poetic language, which in turn is a functional variety of language as a whole. And Jakobson would be citing examples of such agrammatisms from David Borluk and E.E. Cummings, trying not to bring such anomalies outside the framework of linguistic interest, which was the case of Chomsky, but rather to focus the attention of linguists on how the poetic function works, in contrast to other communicative functions. Charles Bernstein noted that in his book, Pitch of Poetry, that among linguists, Jakobson had the most noticeable influence on him with the concept of poetic language, as I quote from Charles, verbal language that foregrounds its material features, providing an understanding of poetry as less about communicating a message than an engagement with the medium of verbal language itself. The title of Barrett Wotton's Book of Criticism, Questions of Poetics, is characteristically a borrowing from Jakobson, namely from Jakobson's French language monograph, Questions de Poétique. Wotton's own poetic work resists the poetry of narrative coherence and communicative ease. And some of their titles have linguistic references in them. Frame, for example, refers to framing in cognitive linguistics. Condit, to the metaphor of language as condit, much debated by linguists of the 1970s. And in Wotton's other scholarly work titled Total Syntax, 1985, syntactic connections between words are conceptualized as socio-economic relations. The act of writing is viewed as an utterance in the broadest socio-cultural context, from everyday life to political action. In the same article, Linguistics and Poetics, one of Jakobson's concerns was how the poetic function of language differs from what he calls metalingual function. Let me quote from Jakobson. It may be objected that meta-language also makes a sequential use of equivalent units when combining synonymic expressions into an equational sentence. A equals A. Mare is the female of the horse. Poetry and meta-language, however, are in diametrical opposition to each other. In meta-language, the sequence is used to build an equation, whereas in poetry, the equation is used to build a sequence. In the texts of the poets of the language movement, especially in Charles Bernstein, the functions of poetic and metapoetic or metalingual are often combined within the framework of one text, or even in one utterance or line. For example, this principle generates like sort of cross-cutting self-reference and metatextuality, is in this text called This Line. This line is no more than an illustration of a European theory. This line is bereft of a subject. This line has no reference apart from its context in this line. This line is only about itself. This line is stripped of emotion. The Language Journal frequently published essays on linguistic and semiotic issues with titles suggesting discussions of current trends in language studies of those times. And the Language Journal was published for only 3 years, from 78 to 81. And such was, for example, a text by Bruce Andrews called Text and Context, which was engaged into a discussion of text linguistics, of what is text or what is context, things like that. Metalinguistic reflection invades the poetic texts themselves. One of Bernstein's hallmark poems is, to my mind, is a ruminative ablution, which begins with the words, "I've got a hang for long, but no truck with parole." And it is the long that is chosen from the Saussurean dichotomy. It is a system that is often imperceptible to the speaker, but determines the rules for choosing linguistic elements. And what we hear on the streets is speech, parole. Getting into a poetic text, this speech acquires an inner coherence at the level of the whole text. Parole is centrifugal, lang is centripetal, as Charles Bernstein writes in another book of essays. Let me quote from it. Because the centripetal questions of speech force of language, speech is the red herring of verse, the secret of the poem's delusions, because then a poem has by language evanescence, nothing that can be mistreated as solid objectified thing. So the main conflict in this poetry is between speech and language, or rather between language and discourses as forms of speech. Poetic language resists non-poetic discourses. If speech is always too human, then language serves as a bridge between subject and object, subjectivity and objectivity. Therefore, the question, whose language, here turns into a relative complement, whose language, as in the title of Bernstein's texts, whose language, without the question mark. It is not the subject or the speaker of the language that is important, but the very relationship between the subject and the predicate within the line and the text. Only the real is real, the little girl who cries out, baby, baby, but forgets to look in the mirror of it doesn't really matter whose, only the appointment of a skewed and derelict parade. My face turns to glass at last. So the meeting place of speech, parole, and language, lang, according to Saussure's theory, is langage, or linguistic activity. And language, according to Bernstein, language in bold capital letters, is the poetic encounter of language with speech, with a special focus on materiality of linguistic units in the act of writing. Some scholars describe what was happening in American linguistics of the 60s and 70s as linguistics wars held between generative grammarians and the cognitive semanticists. Barrett Watton suggests a similar term, poetry wars, that refers to analogous controversies between languagists and conservative poets and critics of the time. It is no coincidence that Bernstein and others were close to the cognitive linguist George Lakoff, who took part in some of the language poets events in the 80s, and who, as we know, dealt as a scholar with the problem of poetic metaphor as a cognitive scheme, as in this book from 1989 with Mark Turner. And Lakoff wrote a whole series of essays and articles in defense of language poets. Charles Bernstein's book, Recalculating, contains 2 poems about pudding, the truth in pudding and how empty is my bread pudding. The second one is actually dedicated to George Lakoff, and the title refers to his concept of metaphors as containers of cognition. The text is a sort of a collection of aphorisms built akin to spatial cognitive metaphors. For example, about poetry as a terrace. Imagine poetry as a series of terraces. Some are huge, others are no bigger than a button, overlooking the city of language. Bernstein's metaphor is often conceptual. It has not only connects two dissimilar entities, but connects them in the act of thinking, in the act of writing as thinking. The similarity of the basis of the usual metaphor is questioned. The metaphor here can be made of a tautology, as in this poem. The similar is like the similar, the simile is like the simile, and so on. Or metaphor itself can be subject to defamiliarization. There ain't nothing like a metaphor, nothing in this world. There ain't nothing you can name that is anything like a metaphor. Of course, it's not only Lakoff's, but also Jakobson's reflections about metaphor and metonymy that did play a part in these poetics. The ideas of not only Jakobson, but other Russian formalists such as Shklovsky and Pinyanov were instrumental for language writers in their treatment of language as such by analogy of the word as such. And the formalists' opponents, such as Voloshinov and Bakhtin, are also referred to by language poets when it comes to especially when it comes to the critique of discourses and social formations. Now to the last part of my talk. Speaking of Russian counterparts, if we may call them so, of language poetry, the first contemporaneous analog that comes to mind is, of course, Moscow conceptualist poetry. Without explicitly proclaiming an orientation towards language, poets such as Monastyrsky, Nekrasov, and Rubinstein are indeed operating with language and discourses in ways similar to those of Land Poe. For example, Bruce Anders's poetry is close to Nekrasov's visual poetry, Grineer's card poetry close to Rubinstein's, or Monastyrsky's text operations parallel Ron Silliman's, some of the Ron Silliman's reiterating writing techniques. A similar figure to that of Jack Spicer in the US was, I would suggest, the Russian linguist and poet Alexander Candratos, whose scholarly works are fairly well known for linguists in Russia, but whose stunning poetic heritage has recently been restored from the archives. This, as far as I know, was the great work of Mikhail Pavlovets while his trip to Trier. And all of this reveals a pre-conceptual poetics reminiscent of the more famous Lianosova group, though Kandratov as a poet was not at all well known at the time. And he started to write in the 1950s, as early as that. And he was a virtuoso in all forms of poetic experimentation, from visual Baroque poems to computer-generated aleatoric poems. And some of his poems could well be attributed to what in the United States was called language poetry, in particular due to the widespread use of linguistic terminology, without any pretension for political agendas, of course. Well, linguistic terminology is abundant in his works. It appears in the titles of some of his poetic cycles, such as graphemes, morphemes, parts of speech, etc. Despite these similarities between language poetry and Russian conceptualists, which are pretty obvious at first sight, a mutual fascination was involved more between them and meta-realist circles of poets in Russia. Michael Palmer, yeah, these are the Moscow conceptualists. Michael Palmer was, along with Lynn Hegenian, most actively involved in such American-Russian poetic transfers. In an interview with Vladimir Aristov, a Russian meta-realist poet, whom we're happy to have with us now in Zoom, Michael Palmer noted that some common points between him and some Russian poets, especially the fact that they were devoted to what he calls exploratory poetics, and also a poetry of critical negativity and cultural resistance. I will quote from his interview. With Aigi, Parshikov, Khlebnikov, and others, I perceived the ancient modern resonance, which was new to me and which helped me in a new and broader understanding of the time horizons of innovative poetry. These lessons have stayed with me and deeply influenced my work. And Palmer also writes about his meetings with Gennady Aigi and Roman Gapson while he was a student at Harvard. The poets of the language movement were fortunate enough to get in direct contact with the Russian formal school. The Russian poets, as such, and also with the Russian formal school. When they came in 1989, it was the four of them who came: Wotton, Davidson, Fegenian, and Silliman, and they were invited by Arkady Dragomoshenko for a conference during the summer school. And right there in Leningrad, they should have met the Russian neo-formalist scholar Lydia Ginsburg, whose talk, titled "The Historical Significance of Apayaz," was on the program of the conference these language poets attended. The conference itself was associated with one of the key formalist concepts. Its title was "Poetic Function, Language, Consciousness, Society." And it was, as I've already told, organized by Arkady Dragomoshenko, at that time the chairman of the so-called creative program at the Soviet Cultural Foundation, which was also called Poetic Function. And this meeting became perhaps the first collective meeting in history between Russian and American poets. Earlier Soviet poets such as Yevtushenko and Voznesensky had participated in readings with the beatniks, as we know, but that was not a collective endeavor, albeit officially sanctioned. By the late 80s, some poets of the language movement, Hegenian and Coolidge, had already visited the USSR, but this time the visit was part of a large international event. However, the main thing that happened at this conference was direct contact between representatives of the American language tendencies in literature and representatives of the two leading schools of unofficial Russian poetry, meta-realism and conceptualism. However, the number of meta-realists who attended the conference prevailed. Among them were Dragomoshenko, Parshikov, Ivan Zhdanov, Vladimir Aristov, Ilya Kutik. From the conceptualist camp, only Dmitry Prigov was present. There are different opinions about the proximity of language poetry and Russian conceptualism. Lynn Hegenian, for example, believes that with some common formal features, the two movements differed to the same extent that the American language and Western capitalism differed from the Russian language and Soviet communism. Meta-realism turned out to be a closer paradigm for language poetry due to, I quote from Hegenian, a fascination with the epistemological and perceptual nature of language's thinking, the belief that poetic language is a suitable tool for exploring the world, an interest in the linguistic layering of a landscape, end quote. What all of the three groups of poets, language poets, conceptualists, and materialists, shared was an interest to the relationship between language, consciousness, and society, suggested by the title of the conference. Jakobson's poetic function of language made all of them related to the legacy of the Russian avant-garde. But the problematic was more in line with the intellectual landscapes of the 80s. It is no coincidence that Dragomoshenko decided to invite a number of prominent Soviet linguists to participate, such as Vyacheslav Ivanov, Maxim Shapir, Suren Zalyan, and some others. During these years, the problem of consciousness began to emerge in the vanguard of scholarly studies. In the science of language, the cognitive approach, conceptology, linguistics of altered states of consciousness, and the theory of metaphor. So the mutual interest of conceptualism and materialist poets and contemporary linguistics was as topical as it was long overdue. We can learn about how this conference went from the book Leningrad, published in America in the wake of the trip in 1991. In it, there are many references to the legacy of Russian formalism. Michael Davidson admits that formalism was a treasure for language school theory. The formal school is associated here with a special Russian approach to the poem as an object. In the American tradition, objectivism was just an episode in the activities of a small group of poets, Zhukovsky, Opp, and Rakoczy, whereas Russian theory gave birth to a whole scientific school of objectivist analysis of artistic structure. As Davidson writes, the unity of two projects, call them scientific and cultural, around the poetic adds up to a kind of myth of the object whose authority ultimately lies in a transcendent inherence. Barrett Watton often refers to Russian formalism in his scholarly works, and here in Leningrad, he projects the concept of literariness as сделанность onto modern poetics, not so much as an aesthetic principle, but as an ethical imperative. A quote from Watton: Viktor Shklovsky's notions of the orchestration of the verbal material, the familiarization, and the semantic shift have seemed to us thus not simply a question of art, but one of ethics, the meaning of creative action in a context of some kind that cannot entirely be accounted for. The Russian poets the Americans met in the late 80s in the USSR seemed to defamiliarize their own tradition of defamiliarization. In late Soviet Leningrad, language poets perceived the city of Opayaz in its formal contours as a lived rather than represented experience. And Opayaz acted as a kind of a model of a utopian marriage of the American and late Soviet avant-gardes. And I especially like the metaphor suggested in the title of Jacob Edmonds' brilliant book, specifically in reference with reference to this context, common strangeness, as he calls it, common strangeness. Charles Bernstein too likes to quote Shklovsky, in particular his idea of laying bare the device. And one of his poems is named with an explicit reference to Russian formalism through an even more explicit intertext with Marcel Duchamp, Ballad Laid Bare by His Devices, even a bachelor machine for MLA. And the Manifesto, like Tractatus, Artifice of Absorption, is inspired by this very formalist concept of device as ostranение. Bernstein's key term, artifice, echoes the title of Shklovsky's Manifesto in English, art as device. The neo-formalism, as it were, of the language poets was not a result of a doctrine straightforwardly received from the Russians, but the fruit of the cultural transfer of formalist concepts through a different culture in a different chronotope. The form here was no longer the flagship of the revolution, but was placed in the neo-avant-garde tradition as a countercultural criticism of art. Bernstein sometimes mocks at the form. It is this: form is never more than an extension of male content. There it went, flapping, more uselessness. Brushing aside the neo-formalists, he calls his personal movement nude formalism, as in his book co-authored with Susan B, called The Nude Formalism, as if formalism descended from Duchamp's scandalous painting as a bridesmaid stripped bare by her bachelors. Strictly speaking, in the American tradition, conceptualism originated as a movement in visual arts, as we know, and it is only indirectly associated with poetic movements, in contrast to the Russian situation, in which these vectors, the visual and the verbal, were merged into one. However, this does not prevent some American literary theorists from classifying some of language poets as conceptual writers. For example, Marjorie Perloff considers them like the others of conceptual writers and their others, as she names them. In fact, most of the techniques Charles Bernstein uses may be identified as conceptual. For example, the text questionnaire presents lines one after another in the questionnaire form, or the text Katakris is my love, which is not on the screen, is built on a number of katakrisa. And the mini poem titled Poem Loading, as its text suggests, does not contain the poem itself, only its concept. So conceptualism for Bernstein is also the art of self-refutation, which is revealed in the text called The Lie of Art. I don't want innovative art, I don't want experimental art, I don't want conceptual art. Now, lastly, I would just like to credit those Russian poets who have been influenced by language writing, apart from those mentioned earlier, of course. Characteristically, all of them listed here have contributed, almost all of them listed here have contributed to translating US language poetry into Russian. And this is especially the case of Alexander Skidan. And this is an excerpt from Skidan's cycle of poems called Objects and Parts, a poem unfolding as a meta-poetic versified essay with statements engaged in language games with the space of the poem itself. And this foldedness of linguistic and discourse matter, a reversal of poetic lines towards themselves, is indeed a way of language writing, defamiliarizing its own productive devices. Two-directional transfers between the Russian and the American literary traditions, which, as I have argued, penetrated language-centered writing over the last 50 years, are still underway. Language poets and their associates keep on interacting with the Russian contexts. The two most recent cases in point are Charles Bernstein's collection, Sign Under Test, translated into Russian by Jan Brabstein, published last year. And as far as I know, another book by Bernstein is on the way in the Russian translation. Or Barrett Watton's ongoing large poem called Not Zeit, being translated into Russian. A part of it has been published already, and actively feedbacked by young Russian poets on the web. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to show two fresh examples of what might be also called language-focused poetry, written across languages by poets identifying themselves as both Russian and American. And one of them is Eugene Ostashevsky's poem dedicated to the siege of Leningrad. where the shifts between Russian, English, and German are continuously self-reflected, as in this line. Your prospects are letters of beach, buchene Leitung. For literature is a beach, it is wood or woad. This wood you call book, read book, but in the mountains Chinar, Makar, and the letter Bukva. So this is translingual poetry, conscious of its own language issues. I might even go as far as to call this trans-language writing. Another piece of such writing is a new 2021 poem by Ivan Sokolov, titled, yeah, you can see the title on the screen. I can't see it myself now. This is just a short excerpt from this poem, which has not yet been published. It was just only read out loud in one of his readings. And I will just wind up my presentation by reading Ivan Sokolov's own self-translation of this fragment. So this poem was self-translated into English by himself. And anyway, in what language should I keep silent towards you, the way any music is silent? In the words of one who was in love, it only ever is silent. In this one, на этом, на, atem, no, autumn, nomatem, in a tight tongue, a moment of utopia, never to abolish oblivion, not even by an atom. And I thank you all for your generous attention.